When Betty moved to Korea for her studies 2 years ago, she never imagined life would take such a drastic turn. Like most K-drama girls at heart, she had pictured a dreamy, soft life, glowing skin, bustling cafes, maybe even a quiet romance. But reality was nothing like the scenes she'd once binge-watched on her laptop. A year ago, her brother had fallen seriously ill. Their family poured everything they had into his treatment. Savings, loans, even her tuition cushion. But he still died. It broke more than their hearts. It drained them completely. Betty didn't come from a poor home. Her parents had planned well enough to support her through school, even if things got tough. But not this tough. She stared at the email on her screen with shaky hands, her heart thudding loudly in her chest. Subject: Final interview, surrogacy program. Her mother would rather have her return to Nigeria than go through with this. But how would they find out? She could always say she picked up 2 new part-time jobs to cover her bills. She sighed deeply and curled into herself on the bed. Her rent was due in 2 weeks, and the paycheck from her shift at the chicken shop barely covered food and transportation. The next morning, she woke up early and got ready for the interview. The address led her to a quiet building tucked away in a cleaner part of town. 3 floors of polished glass and silence. The kind of place that looked like it had secrets. She passed through a few security checks. More than she expected. It felt too discreet and too hidden. But then again, in a place like Korea, where appearances mattered more than truth, maybe discretion was the only way. Inside the interview room sat 2 people who looked every bit the perfect upper-class couple. The woman, elegant and glowing, wore a soft smile and a tailored coat that looked far too expensive to wrinkle. She gave off warmth, the kind that made you feel safe, even if you didn't know why. But the man beside her was a different story. He looked handsome and wore a clean-cut sharp black suit, but his eyes were distant. He barely flicked toward Betty, like this meeting was just another item on a checklist. Something in her stomach turned, but she sat anyway. This was her last resort. Later, after questions were asked and answers given, Betty flipped through the forms before finally signing. The pay was more than she expected, enough to cover her rent for 5 years and still have something left for her brother's memorial. "Thank you," the beautiful woman who had introduced herself as Bo Min said with a warm, gracious smile. Her husband had said a few reassuring words about ensuring the best hospital care. But beyond that, he barely spoke. He was polite, but distant, like he had a wall no one was meant to climb. A date was set for the first hospital appointment. It wasn't until Betty returned home and searched their names online that her mind reeled. They were not just any couple. Bo Min Yoon, heiress of the prestigious Bo family, and her husband, Ji Ho Yoon, a corporate shark, known for hostile takeovers and a cold, ruthless business reputation. The kind of man CEOs whispered about in boardrooms. A tycoon who made the market tremble when he moved. Betty stared at her screen in disbelief. She had just agreed to carry the child of Korea's most private power couple, and they had chosen her. Everything happened so fast. Betty moved into the apartment provided for her, which was just a short drive from Ji-ho's private high-end clinic. The procedure went smoothly, and the embryo transfer was successful. A private chauffeur was assigned to take her to and from school. Bo Min visited her 4 times a week, always glowing with excitement. Having a child was something Bo Min deeply longed for, and watching her dream slowly come to life brought her a new kind of joy, one Betty hadn't seen before in real life. Ji-ho came around occasionally. He wanted a child too, but unlike his wife, he wasn't in a hurry. He believed that when the time was right, it would happen. Their marriage didn't seem particularly close. Aside from physical intimacy, there wasn't much warmth between them. They were more like business partners than lovers. Still, Betty minded her business. She was just there to do her part. 2 weeks after the embryo transfer, they scheduled a visit to the hospital. Bo Min showed up, looking more anxious than ever. Betty sat on the clinic bed, her fingers tangled tightly in her lap, knees wobbling beneath her. 2 weeks. 2 weeks of pretending to feel normal while wondering, what if it didn't work? What if all of this had been for nothing? The nurse returned with a soft smile and a clipboard tucked under her arm. "The results are in," she said. "Congratulations. You're pregnant." A beat of silence. Betty's breath caught in her throat. Pregnant. Her vision blurred, not from tears but from the rush of everything hitting her at once. It wasn't her baby, technically, but something was growing inside her. Bomin gasped beside her and covered her mouth, her eyes already wet. "Oh my God," she whispered, reaching for Betty's hand. "You're our miracle." A large bouquet of flowers arrived later that day, white orchids and blush roses, from Jiho's assistant. There was no note, only his signature printed on the card like a business deal. And just like that, everything was real. Then came the one event that changed everything. It happened the morning they were heading out for Betty's first trimester checkup. Betty was already dressed and waiting in her small living room, hands gently resting on her lap. The sound of the doorbell made her heart skip. She knew who it was. She rose to her feet just as the door opened. She entered with her usual grace, polished yet warm, elegance in every step. There was always something reassuring about her presence, even though she was someone Betty had only seen from afar before all this began. "You look well," she said with a soft smile, reaching to brush a hand briefly against Betty's arm. "Did you sleep okay?" "Yes, Ma. I did, thank you." Betty returned the smile quietly. She had called earlier that morning, just to be sure Betty felt all right, the way she always did. Together, they stepped outside. The chauffeur stood waiting beside the black vehicle, and as always, he opened the back door first for Betty. She slid in carefully, adjusting her seatbelt over her small frame. From the window, she watched the woman approach from the other side of the car. And then, it happened. Just a few steps from the car, she paused. Her hand moved instinctively to her temple, and then her knees buckled. "Ma!" Betty gasped, reaching for the door handle. Her breath caught in her throat as the woman collapsed to the ground. The chauffeur moved faster than Betty could react. He rushed to her side, quickly assessing her, then carried her into the car. "We'll take her to the clinic," he said, already pulling out his phone to alert the staff. Betty could barely speak. Her hands were trembling. She didn't know what was happening, only that the one person who had shown up for her over and over again was now unconscious beside her. And in that moment, all Betty could do was pray. When Jiho got the call about the collapse, something in his chest tightened. He had known Bo-min for over a decade. If there was one thing constant about her, it was her strength. Graceful. Nothing ever seemed to shake her. The only thing that ever truly weighed on her heart was the absence of a child. He canceled every meeting without thinking twice and headed straight to the clinic. He remembered she was supposed to accompany Betty for her first trimester checkup, yet now, she was the one hospitalized. When he arrived, he went to the ward. His heart skipped. There she was, still, quiet, pale. He hadn't seen her like that in years. She looked smaller somehow, as though something had been quietly draining her while he wasn't looking. Betty stood near the foot of the bed. She bowed slightly. "Sir." He nodded, distracted. "How long has she been like this?" "She fainted right before we got in the car," Betty said, voice low. He didn't respond, just turned and asked to see the chief physician. Minutes later, he stood in a quiet office, the low hum of the air conditioner the only sound. The doctor handed him a folder, her file. He opened it, expecting maybe fatigue, stress, dehydration. But as his eyes moved down the page, his breath caught. Diagnosis: Stage 4 stomach cancer. His hands began to shake. 1,000 thoughts collided in his head, but one thing was clear. She knew. And she hadn't told him. And now, time might be slipping through their fingers. When Bo-min woke up later, her eyes adjusted slowly to the dim light of the hospital room. At the far end, Jiho sat by the wall, a laptop on his knees, his face half lit by the screen. He looked up the moment he noticed her stir. Their eyes met. Quietly, he closed the laptop and walked over to her bedside. He took her hand in his. It startled her. Not the touch, but the tenderness in it. Jiho had never been the type to hold hands. Not even during the early years. "How do you feel?" he asked, voice low, almost cautious. Bomin felt something soft brush against her chest, like a feather against her heart. She smiled faintly. "Tired," she said. There was a long pause between them, filled with everything they'd never really said. Later, after the nurse had stepped out and the room fell quiet again, he finally asked the question that had been burning in him since the moment he saw the diagnosis. "Why didn't you tell me?" She turned her face slightly, avoiding his gaze. "I didn't think you'd care." The words cut deeper than he expected. He sat down slowly. "I had a feeling," he admitted. "Not exactly this. But I knew something wasn't right." Bomin let out a weak breath. "We've never really lived like a couple, Ji-ho. You and I, we just existed beside each other. The physical part happened, yes, but it wasn't connection," he finished for her. She nodded. "But still," he said, "you're my wife. I've lived with you, shared a name, a home. I would have gone all out to make sure you were okay. Physically, at least." She looked at him then, and for a moment, something in her eyes softened. Not regret, not guilt, just a quiet sadness, the kind that came from years of assuming wrong things and living like they were true. And just like that, everything changed. Betty felt a deep sadness settle in her chest. A woman so gentle, yet carrying a burden so heavy. The daughter of the Bo family, Bo-min, had become someone she quietly admired. Despite her illness, she never let it weigh her spirit down. She remained kind, especially to those outside her home. To Betty, at least, she had always shown warmth. The next time Betty visited the hospital, she noticed something different. Ji-ho was there, seated beside Bo-min's bed, though he looked like he was in a hurry. Still, he stayed. Bo-min's face lit up when she saw Betty walk in, and that smile alone told Betty how much the visit meant. Ji-ho turned to her then, and for the first time, they had a real conversation, one that wasn't limited to a polite, "How are you?" He asked if she was doing okay, how the baby was progressing, if she needed anything. Before leaving, he even told her to call if any problem came up. It caught Betty off guard. She raised a brow after he walked out, surprised by his sudden concern. Maybe, just maybe, he had finally decided to take an interest in the child. Perhaps Bo-min's illness had awakened something in him, a sense of duty, or guilt, or care. Whatever it was, it felt like something had shifted. Betty continued her regular checkups. The chauffeur assigned to her never missed a day, driving her to the hospital and back home without fuss. It became a quiet routine, one she had grown used to. One afternoon, during a second trimester checkup, Betty passed by the oncology ward and decided to visit Bo-min. She found her seated near the window, a scarf wrapped gently around her head, the sunlight brushing her pale skin with gold. Despite the toll of chemo, her smile still shone like it had every time. Soft, kind, unshaken. They talked about names that day, names the baby might answer to, letters that sounded strong or beautiful. Bo-min handed her a small notebook filled with name ideas she had been jotting down. "Just in case you get stuck," she joked lightly, though her breath came a little slower now. Still, there was a brightness in her that made Betty quietly marvel. But outside that hospital room, things weren't so calm. Word of Bo-min's illness had reached her family, and they were furious. The Bo family, steeped in old wealth and influence, didn't believe for a second that Ji-ho hadn't known. To them, his ignorance was an even deeper betrayal. If he truly cared for the woman they gave him in marriage, wouldn't he have noticed sooner? Wouldn't he have acted? They threatened legal action, arrest, scandal, consequences. But Ji-ho didn't seem shaken. His silence toward their threats felt more like indifference than fear. Bo-min, however, remained firm. When she heard what her family intended, she only said one thing. "If they touch my husband, I will no longer be their daughter." She meant it. And though she was the one battling for her life, her voice carried the weight of someone still determined to protect the man she chose, even if that man hadn't always been there. Then one afternoon, Betty came by again. Bo-min reached for her hand and held it gently. Her voice was soft but steady. "Promise me something," she said. "Stay in the child's life. No matter what." Betty's throat tightened. She didn't know what to say. Her heart felt too full, too heavy. This wasn't part of the original plan. Not like this. But she loved this woman now. She had grown to care deeply for her. And for the baby growing inside her. Still, a part of her hesitated. But how could she say no? So she didn't. She nodded, blinking back the sting in her eyes. She didn't want Bo-min to feel even a moment of sadness. Later that day, Ji-ho arrived. He sat by Bo-min's bedside, and the two of them talked for a long time. Betty stayed quietly in the background, not wanting to interrupt. Bo-min asked about work, teasing lightly, "How are you managing the empire without me?" Ji-ho gave a tired smile. "I haven't been able to concentrate," he said. "Not with my beloved wife in the hospital." Bo-min laughed softly, her eyes lighting up. "Since when did you grow such a sweet mouth?" He smiled back, something unspoken passing between them. From her quiet corner, Betty watched the moment unfold. A wave of emotion swelled inside her. She wished there was no sickness. Wished things were simpler. Wished this was how they had always been, warm, close, filled with laughter and love. Just normal. Before Betty gave birth, Bo-min had pleaded with her one last time, tears in her eyes, her voice trembling. "Please," she whispered, clutching Betty's hand. "Don't leave her. Stay in her life." And this time, Betty promised. She meant it with everything in her. When the day finally came, Ji-ho stood outside the delivery room, tense and quiet. When he heard the first cry, something in him cracked wide open. The nurse handed him the tiny, wriggling baby. The moment he held her, a rush of emotions overwhelmed him. He was a father. He carried the baby into Bo-min's hospital room. She was weak, barely able to lift her head, but when she saw the baby, tears streamed down her face. She reached out with trembling arms and held her daughter close. In her eyes was a look no one could mistake. Guilt. The unbearable sorrow of a mother who knew she wouldn't stay long enough to raise her child. She wished Betty were there to see her, but Betty was still resting after the delivery. The next day, Bo-min died. Betty held the baby in her arms and wept. Ji-ho stood nearby, silent but visibly shattered. No matter what had happened between them, Bo-min was his wife. Over the past months, he had grown closer to her again. Shared quiet conversations, laughter, and hope. Now she was gone. And he wished he had loved her better, earlier. Bo-min was buried in a private ceremony attended by close family and friends. Betty was there, carrying the baby in her arms, dressed in soft white. Not long after the funeral, the Bo family began making noise. They questioned Ji-ho's ability to raise the child, called him irresponsible, and insisted the baby be raised by them. Ji-ho didn't argue. He chased them out of the house. Then came Bo-min's lawyer. He arrived with her final will, carefully prepared and signed just weeks before her passing. According to Bo-min's wishes, the baby, named Yuewe, was to be raised by her father, Ji-ho, and Betty, if she was willing. The lawyer also outlined the distribution of her estate. 50% was left to her daughter, Yuewe. 20% was willed to Betty. 10% to her husband, Ji-ho. 10% to her maiden family. And the remaining 10% to the poor and orphan children, the one she often said reminded her of the daughter she hadn't yet met. Later that evening, Betty sat across from Ji-ho, rocking the baby gently in her arms. Her voice was quiet. Ji-ho looked at her carefully before speaking. "Do you wish to stay and care for little Yuewe?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Betty's eyes didn't shift away. She answered softly, yet firmly, "I will. I promised her." Ji-ho nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling between them. "Thank you," he said. "And I promise, this won't affect your education. I'll make sure of that."